Sintonize-se no Nova Consumer Podcast, uma série de conversas sobre direito do consumo.
Welcome to another episode of the second season of the Nova Consumer Podcast, entirely focused on sustainability. Today, we're talking with Claire Bright. She is an assistant professor in private law and director of the Nova Knowledge Center on Business, Human Rights and the Environment at Nova School of Law. She holds a PhD in international law from the European University Institute. Prior to joining Nova, she worked at the London School of Business and Management and was a research assistant at the Center for Social Legal Studies of the University of Oxford. My name is Maria Miguel Oliveira da Silva, legal advisor at the Nova Consumer Lab, and today I'm with Jorge Moraes Carvalho, director of the Nova Consumer Lab. Welcome aboard, Professor Claire. Let's start with the quick part, a time of particular difficulty for jurists, where the guest must answer quickly about herself. Let's go. Paper bag or plastic bag?
Paper bag, definitely.
Hit a local steak or a pitayo from Indonesia?
Well, I'm vegetarian, so definitely not a local steak, but maybe local fruits and veg.
Perfect. Conventional car or electric car?
Conventional car for now, definitely next one will be electric.
Coffee or chocolate?
Chocolate.
If you were a lawmaker for just one day and you were sure about the approval of the law, what rule would you create?
A law that would make it legally a legal duty for companies to respect human rights.
And if you could solve just one human rights problem, which one would you solve?
Child labor.
And can you give us some examples of sustainable practices you adopt in your daily life?
So aside from the vegetarian diet, I walk a lot. So I always walk to work and walk to my children's school. And like everyone, I recycle, that sort of things.
And what is the myth about sustainable consumption that you must need to clear up at family dinners?
I would say the fact that sustainability is too costly. There is clearly a business case now for sustainability, and especially if consumers demand it. There is a growing demand for it. So I think that would be the one.
Thank you so much, Claire, for your quick answers and for being here in our podcast. It's really a pleasure for us and for me. We end now our sprint with these fast questions, starting the second part of our program, where we want a more in-depth conversation. Claire, why human rights? Are there any interesting stories out there to share with us?
Well, first of all, thank you so much for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be here. Human rights are, for me, very central in every aspect of society. We know that companies can have positive impacts on society and on human rights. They can contribute to a country's economic growth, development. They can create jobs, transfer skills and technology. But we also know, and this has been becoming more and more, there's been documented, I would say, over the past few decades now, that companies can cause and contribute to human rights harms, both in their activities and throughout their supply chains and their value chains worldwide. And so considering the essential role that companies play in our daily life, in getting all the goods that we need and that we consume on a daily basis available to us, there is a particularly important role that they should play and they need to play in ensuring that human rights are respected.
When in your life did you start thinking of this topic? This is such an interesting topic.
It's a very good question. I think I was very lucky when I was doing my master's degree in international and commercial law and private international law at the Sorbonne University in France, to cross paths with a professor, Professor Horacia Murwad, who introduced me and introduced us, all the students, to these topics and started to get me to think about these issues and starting to wonder where my computer comes from, where the water that or the plastic bottle or the glass that I drink from come from, etc., the chair that I'm sitting on. And really, when you start looking into it, you start seeing how really important it is in every aspect of your life, and what, as a consumer as well, your role and your expectations can be in relation to human rights and sustainability.
It's so important. The persons and the professors we find in our way, they determine lots of times our interests and how we see the world as a whole. Thank you so much for sharing this with us. In your opinion, what is the biggest problem regarding human rights violations that directly contends with consumer law?
Well, so I would say unsustainable supply chains is a big issue, and we've seen that reinforced we've seen the difficulties in particular of not regulating supply chains reinforced with the coronavirus pandemic and the coronavirus crisis. If we look at a few data, for instance, if we look for instance, concerning child labor, studies estimate that just in Côte d'Ivoire, 1.2 million children work in cocoa farms that supply the cocoa to the chocolate companies, and it's 0.9 million in Ghana. Now, these countries supply about 70% of the cocoa that we consume. So they have a huge importance there, and there are very widespread issues of child labor in these sectors and in these areas. If we turn now to forced labor and we look at the data from the International Labour Organization, we find that 16 million people are trapped in forced labor in the private sector. A lot of those in supply chains, again, that provide the products, supply the products to multinational corporations. Earlier, I was looking at the 2021 Global Gender Gap Report of the World Economic Forum, and it now estimates that it will take 135.6 years to close the gender gap worldwide. It's actually gone worse. It was better last year, but the pandemic has made it actually worse. All of this to say
Why? Why do you think the pandemic?
Well, the pandemic has made it worse because women have been the one that have been the most affected. So if you think about women who have been working in the front line to provide the essential services during the pandemic, if you think about women, for instance, that supply textile in the textile factories, in particular in Asia and South America, that have been very affected by the lockdowns, because then companies have, quite a lot of companies and particular brands have decided to stop their orders or have used the force majeure clause in the contracts not to pay for orders that had already been carried out. And this had extremely important impact and implications on that gender gap, but also the extra additional pressure in terms of childcare that women have, not only women, but women in particular have had to deal with during the pandemic. If we look just at the academic world, for instance, there have been some statistics about publications and how women during the pandemic, women academics have been less productive than men because of the extra childcare pressure. So these are all elements that points to that worsening of the gender gap. And all these issues that we see are issues that are very present in the activities of companies, but also in the supply chains of companies, and that are simply not, again, we go back to the issue of the lack of regulation of the supply chains.
Does the consumer have a moral duty to investigate the actions of the producer? Or should this responsibility not shift from its true source, the professional, the trader?
Well, it's very much a shared responsibility, I would say. But interestingly, I suppose the responsibility of the consumer is something that has been less looked into. In 2011, in June 2011, so 10 years ago, when the UN Human Rights Council universally approved the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights, they really relied on that three-pillar structure, with the state having a duty to protect, a legally binding duty under international law to protect human rights, the company having a responsibility to respect human rights, both in their activities and throughout their value chains, and both the states and companies having a responsibility and a duty in relation to remedy for affected individuals. And what we've been seeing is that over the past few years in particular, that second pillar, the one on the corporate responsibility to respect, has started to crystallize into legally binding obligations. In the UN Guiding Principles, it was very much presented as a social expectation. So a more moral, ethical duty arising out of social expectation, the so-called social license to operate for companies. But if we look at the text, it doesn't say much about consumers and the responsibility of consumers. Now it is clear to me that consumers, we as consumers also have a responsibility. But at the same time, it's a tricky one to put in place, because not everyone has the means to fulfill that responsibility. It might be financial means, because it is more costly to purchase sustainable. But it might also be in terms of finding adequate information. It's actually very time consuming to try and find the relevant information to see where the products have been sourced and in which conditions. And today, I think there is a lack of transparency on these issues, and it's actually a really difficult task for the average consumer to find the relevant information as to how sustainable the products they're buying are.
So we can still complain about corporations and not have and accept that the consumer can resign from their role as investigators of production, or not?
So I wouldn't say that they can resign. I think certainly there is a certain, and there is a growing awareness, I would say, of consumers now of these issues, and more consumers now demand from the companies they purchase from that they have more responsible practices, and this has huge impacts. I can see companies starting to shift practices. In fact, in the study that I co-authored for the European Commission, where we looked at supply chain, due diligence requirements throughout the supply chains, we asked various stakeholders throughout Europe, and in particular companies, what was pushing them to exercise human rights and environmental due diligence at the moment when they had practices like that in place. And the pressure from consumer was certainly one of the most important elements that was mentioned by companies, together with the pressure from investors as well, and various other elements. But it's certainly a key. It was one of the top three elements that was mentioned. So it's certainly it can play an important role to pass on that message that it does matter to consumers as well. And an important point that is related to that is companies don't always realize it, but through their purchasing practices, they can encourage, they can facilitate human rights issues in their supply chain. So again, if we go back to the example of textile workers in supply chain, if you as a brand order from one day to the next an enormous amount of products without increasing the price or etc., what you're going to be doing in practice is pushing the suppliers to have workers stay later, work more hours, and you're going to be basically pushing these labor rights issues in your supply chain. And so I think that's something that not so many companies have started to think about, how their own purchasing practices might actually encourage these human rights issues, but it's something that is very key to the solution, I would say, of the problem.
Very interesting and very important, not only for the companies, the corporations, but also for the consumers. I don't think they are aware, or they are all aware of the importance of their choices, I think.
Absolutely.
So what does a transparent supply chain look like?
Well, so first of all, if we, I was mentioning earlier the UN guiding principles on business and human rights, and the second pillar on the corporate responsibility to respect human rights. According to the UN guiding principles, in order for companies to fulfill that responsibility to respect human rights, companies should have in place what is called a human rights due diligence process. And a human rights due diligence process is basically a process that allows company to identify, prevent, mitigate, and account for the adverse human rights impacts with which it may be involved. The first step of the human rights due diligence process is really about identifying the adverse impacts. And that can be both the actual impacts, but also the potential ones that have not yet occurred, but may occur in the future. Now, as part of his first step, so first step is really becoming aware. What are my impacts? It's to prevent the kind of turning a blind eye. Oh, this was happening, but I didn't know about it. The real question is not now, did you or did you not know about it? Is what did you do to find out? And as part of that, as part of the what did you do to find out, this requires a mapping of the supply chain of the companies. And we have companies now that do very elaborate mapping to find out where the different parts of their products and the different processes come from. And this is really important to enable to have a transparent supply chain. The next step is also to pass on that information to the consumer. And I think here new technology might have an important role to play in the future for companies to be able to, for consumers, to be able to see exactly and trace basically where their products come from.
What measures would you propose to combat this problem? So legal measures. Do you think that the certification systems are a good solution, or do you propose other legal solutions?
Well, so many scholarly work have now shown the limitations of certification systems. The difficulties, we have a whole array of certification systems with different standards, no harmonization, and perhaps more problematically, no oversight of these standards. And so at the end of the day, it's very hard to evaluate them and very hard to decide which one might be more reliable than the other. And finding that reliability is an issue. And there has been some issues of greenwashing and all these types. No, not to say that certification might not be helpful. They might be part of the solution, but that's not enough. For me, what is important to solve this issue is really to start regulating. I mean, at the moment, it might sound surprising to some of the people listening to us, but at the international level, there is no legal obligation for companies to respect human rights in their operations and in their supply chains. Some scholars will say that there is, and there's a growing number of scholars that say that international treaty also have direct implications for companies, but it is not a view that has yet reached a consensus. And so
probably
at the moment,
not clear. It's probably not so clear as it should be. Exactly.
At the moment, what is clear is that obviously international treaty, the duty bearers are the states, but it's not very clear and there isn't enough consensus to say that they also apply to companies. And so what we need is to start having regulations in place to say now it's important for companies to respect human rights wherever they operate and to have in place due diligence, human rights due diligence processes and environmental due diligence processes as well to really show this is the way that companies can actually show that they're actually respecting human rights and the environment in practice. So what do they do? What processes do they have in place to find out about these impacts and to actually address them? And I think for me, it might not be the silver bullet, it might not fix all the issues, but it's a starting point that is absolutely necessary, because what we're seeing now is that voluntary measures, and so far we have completely relied on voluntary approaches by companies and on soft law. I was mentioning the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights, which, as its name suggests, are guiding principles. It's a soft law, not a legally binding instrument. They have just not gone far enough. So if we look, for instance, at the 2021 corporate human rights benchmark, out of the 200 and something companies that it evaluated, only half of them declared and had a public document to show that they had human rights due diligence processes in place. And these are some of the 200 largest companies in the world. So I think that's very worrying. So what that tells us is we need to go beyond voluntary mechanisms, we need to go beyond soft law, and we need to move towards hard law. And this is a trend that we are seeing happening certainly here in Europe. We already have 2 countries now. France, where I'm from, was the first country in the world to adopt a law requiring certain large French companies to have human rights and environmental due diligence processes in place in 2017. The Netherlands followed suit just in relation to child labor in 2019. And now at the European level, we have a commitment from the European Commission that a legislative initiative that would require companies in Europe, European companies for sure, possibly as well companies that are not European but that provide goods and services onto the European market, will be subjected to a legal obligation to exercise human rights and environmental due diligence. And I think this is going to be really a really important step forward. Other measures might be interesting. In North America, for instance, they have trade sanctions. So products that, for instance, if you can't prove that you have processes, you have to put due diligence processes in place to prevent, for instance, child labor or forced labor. And if issues of child labor or forced labor can be found somewhere in your supply chain, they might be blocked from entering the market. And this might be something that is interesting to look into as well.
Yes. And let's wait for these measures at the EU level. I think it would be important, as the EU also has an important role, I think, in regulating these kind of issues at a global level. I think the EU might have here a good an importance, I think.
Absolutely.
Let's hope. And now, changing the subject, we would like to know a little bit more about you. How is the experience at Nova going, and is it living up to expectations?
Yes, absolutely. It's going great. So I've been at Nova for about 1.5 years now.
And most of it with a pandemic.
Yes, so that has been the less good aspect of it. That's true. The 2 lockdowns I could have done without. But the experience at Nova has been really great. I have been loving the innovative, the multicultural vibe at Nova. Lovely colleagues such as you, George.
Thank you.
and it's been a really great experience. I've been very lucky to have fantastic students that have been extremely participative and extremely interested in the subjects we've been discussing. That makes a whole difference. So it's been going great so far.
Great. It's also really good for me and for us to have this experience with you, Claire, personally, particularly with you, but also the experience of having professors from other countries, from other backgrounds, social and legal backgrounds. It's really interesting for the university in Portugal, especially in what concerns the legal formation, legal universities. It's not so common in Portugal, as you might know, to have this this experience, and I think Nova is gaining a lot with professors like you. And from a
Thank
personal
you.
perspective, it's great also to have you on board.
Thank you so much. Likewise.
What about Portugal? What's like living in Portugal? What is your experience so far in Lisbon? I think you live in Lisbon.
That's right. It's been amazing. I've lived in 4 countries. I've lived in France, in the UK, in Italy, and in Portugal. And don't tell the other 3 countries, but Portugal is definitely my favorite.
Yes. Why?
It's a mix. I found people extremely welcoming and kind. I love the culture. I love the food. The weather is we're pretty spoiled as well. The sea. I think what's not to like? It's amazing.
Great. So we can expect to have you here for a long time.
For sure.
That's great to hear. And as a consumer, do you feel protected in Portugal? Have you had any problems so far? How do you compare consumer protection in Portugal, France, Italy, and England?
So that's an interesting question. I wouldn't necessarily say that I feel particularly protected, but I wouldn't say that I feel less protected here than anywhere else. And obviously, we have European laws that protect us throughout these countries, apart from the UK now, right? So
it's true, but they are not applied exactly the same.
That's
even if
true.
they are the same, if you have the same provision in different member states, they do not apply entirely exactly the same way in all the member states, I think.
Of course, yeah, very true, and of course, you're the absolute expert on that that subject of consumer protection. So I wouldn't know as well. But certainly, in terms of my own experience as a consumer, what I find, and again, this is across all countries, and it links back to the issues we were discussing earlier. The lack of protection I would find in terms of the lack of transparency. It is very difficult to find the relevant information. So even for someone like me who actually works on business and human rights, I'm obviously well aware of his issues, and I'm trying to find information. I'm trying to buy sustainable products, etc. And I find very difficult to know where to find the reliable information that go beyond marketing. And that is, in that sense, I don't think I feel particularly protected in that perspective here.
Yes. Interesting. Yeah. Thank you so much, Claire.
Thank you.
The final question: who would you recommend we interview in a future episode of our podcast?
Oh, definitely Laura Inigo Alvarez. She's a postdoc here working at Nova School of Law, and she's working with me at the Nova Center on Business and Human Rights and the Environment. She's from Spain. She's wonderful.
Great. I think it's it's good. We will talk to her. And so we come to the end of another episode of the Nova Consumer Podcast. Thank you very much to all our listeners. As always, you can send us your questions to novaconsumерлab@novalaw.unl.pt and follow us on social media. See you soon.